Okay, let's get started. Very warm welcome. Big pleasure to see you back and welcome you to another session of our Discussant of Digital Governance Research Colloquium, where we touch very different topics on from government digitalization to more regulatory big questions of AI. So it's really a broad spectrum. Today, I'm very glad that I have the chance to chair this session where we have Noella Edelmann as our guest speaker, as our guest researcher, and she will talk about the topic, I think, which is really highly relevant, highly of interest, and brings together this digitalization topic, but also the co-creation. And I would say two topics very much in vogue at the moment in research, and bring them together. We don't see that so commonly, so I'm very much interested, and we thought that's a wonderful idea. So the topic you can see is the its relevance in the public sector, positive, negative aspects of digitalization and co-creation, and especially this ethical question, which I think is also often overlooked. So this is also very nice, Noella, that you also will touch the ethics of co-creation or digital co-creation in the public sector. So very warm welcome. Fantastic that you are here. A few words about Noella. You have heard maybe in the introduction talk, she's a very productive, impressive researcher. This makes it a little bit different. With the previous ones, we always had AI as a topic. You are also doing AI, but I think you have a broader approach towards digital transformation and the impact of digitalization on government, on public sector. Noella is a scientist at the Department for Governance and Public Administration at the University for Continuing Education Krems, which is always sounds a little bit interesting, but I think it's a very well-established institute, and coming from Austria, a very well-established research institution in Austria. She has completed her PhD at the Tallinn University of Technology, so a clear technology background, and she has worked as postdoc University of Constance, which also is a landmark institution on public administration here in Germany. And her main research interest, we already touched it, digital transformation of public sector organizations with the specific focus, participation, co-production, new ways of working, collaboration, digital ethics, and open access. So it's a really broad spectrum, but we can really nicely see that from your many publications. I think you also published a lot with Ines Mergel, who I think we also had twice the pleasure to have here as a guest speaker. That's really fantastic that you're here with us. The format, as you're all aware of, is the following: that we start with a presentation of half an hour by the guest lecturer, researcher, and then we open up for Q&A and discussions. We will make a recording of the speech, the presentation itself, but not from the debate, the discussions afterwards. So that's for all of us. I would ask you to mute your microphone, but later on you can come up, of course, with your hands up signal, or you write something in the chat. That's the best way to get into this Q&A dynamic. But I'm very much looking forward to engage interesting discussions, as we always have in this format. Noella, with this, I pass over to you. Thanks for joining us. Very big pleasure. And the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Gerhard, very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be virtually in Berlin. Krems is a bit in the countryside, and yeah, thank you very much for highlighting my background and my research interests. And yes, my feet are in psychology, in organizational psychology. Which maybe helps to understand how I brought these topics together, why I have a very interdisciplinary approach to the topics that I study and the research questions that I ask. And in this presentation, I would like to address three questions in particular. So first of all, why has co-creation become so important in the public sector? And what are the positive and the negative impacts of digitalization? And I would like to finish the presentation by answering the question or highlighting the importance of ethics. So why should we consider ethics in this context? Now, I'd like to go a bit through the definitions because I think this is really, really important. And there's a lot of literature out there on definitions of co-creation, co-production, and just so that we understand what co-creation is, how I approach a co-creation, and as we go through the slides and through my presentation, you'll understand why it's important to be so let's call it pernickety about definitions. So let's start with the definition, a well-established definition by Torfing. This is the definition that highlights what co-creation is. And as you can see from this definition, co-creation can mean a lot of things. So the definition starts off that co-creation is a process, and co-creation also involves information and knowledge exchange. So we go from co-creation being a process to being an exchange. But also, as you move on through the definition, you see that it is also an outcome, such as a new service or a better service or a solution. So co-creation is a process, an exchange. It's an outcome, and it represents public value. And so when we look at co-creation studies, or when we look at what the results of co-creation is and how it's implemented, it's really important to look at how is co-creation understood in this study, in this research, or in practice, because we very often talk about co-creation, and actually we're talking past each other, because I may be talking about the process and somebody else might be actually talking about the outcome. So co-creation processes and achieving the outcome of co-creation very often follows the steps that we find in the policy cycle. So we have different scholars who identify different steps in this process or in this cycle. So, for example, Tress Steen from Leuven, she boils down the co-creation process to 3 steps. Co-designing, so we're working together with stakeholders to design maybe a new public service or to improve a public service. Then there is the next step which is about co-delivery. So where 2 different stakeholders work together to achieve an outcome. So, for example, a teacher will work together with a parent in order to develop a program that suits a student or a pupil that has particular needs. And finally, you have the final phase, which is co-assessment, which is where you look back and you assess the service, the outcome, and you try to provide input in order to improve the next co-creation process or the reiterative process. Then there are other scholars, for example, Lefland and Boviard, who say, okay, that is too simple. We need to break it down a bit more. There is an additional phase, which is this co-commissioning phase. And this co-commissioning phase is very much that kind of like a step before anything happens, where different stakeholders will come together and say, okay, there is an issue we need to address. And what's very special about this co-commissioning phase is that it very much entails the different stakeholders in being involved in deciding which activities to pursue, and in particular the budget. So how much money is going to be spent on the co-creation process, on deciding where is the co-creation process going to be applied to. So what you probably already noticed in the meantime is that co-creation has a temporal dimension. We have if we take the 3 key elements, co-design, co-delivery, and co-assessment, we see that certain aspects are before, they are concurrent, and they are afterwards. Whilst they all share the common, the commonalities of an exchange of knowledge involving or bringing in your competences, Co-design is something that happens before the public service is provided. Co-delivery is basically at the time that the service is being provided. And the co-assessment is where you look retrospectively at what has happened in order to contribute and improve the public service in future. It also means that this has an impact on what this means in terms of involvement, because the co-design, the before, is about trying to improve trust in the service that will in future be delivered, and it's about contributing innovation. At the same time, so at the co-delivery stage, it's about communication, it's about exchanging and interacting in order to deliver the service. Whilst the co-assessment, which is the phase which occurs at the end or after the service has been delivered, it's about providing information about your experiences, providing feedback on how to improve this, and also on using these experiences in order to learn from the experiences and improve in future. Now, let's go to digital co-creation. Again, if we look at co-creation as a cycle, we see that in this model we have even more phases. The differences are that, first of all, not only that there are more phases, but what Leffler and Boviard describe as co-commissioning. In this model, we call it co-planning. And co-planning is a bit more than just establishing a budget, but it's about deciding on how to collaborate innovatively in future, and also on deciding on the activities, such as what are the priorities, and what is the strategy, and what money is available, what are the funds that are available, as well as deciding who the stakeholders are to be involved. There is also an additional phase, which is the co-implementation phase, which, particularly in the digital co-creation context, is important because it represents the necessary collaboration between IT experts, maybe from private sector organizations, and representatives from public administration. So this is a very special phase where we don't have a broad range of stakeholders that we need to identify or think about. This is very clearly that moment when the public administration, the public sector organization decides, okay, this is how we're going to do it, and it's the implementation phase that where the public sector organization works together with IT organizations in order to actually provide this digital service. So let's go through some examples of this, just to kind of like visualize these ideas. So one is, for example, the development of the tourism tax in Lower Austria, which is a tax that we all have to pay when we go and stay in a hotel. And in Lower Austria, this is a process which can be called digital because it's based on Excel sheets and using emails to forward this Excel sheet. So this is an example of co-design where different stakeholders, so we had public administrations, we had hotel owners, we had different representatives from the Chamber of Commerce being involved in saying, okay, how can we design a public service which starts from the moment a hotel guest registers for their hotel room, all the way to paying this tourism tax, which it aggregates and disaggregates the budget for it at different points without there needing to be human intervention, either by forwarding the Excel or by calculating different sums, which leads to several errors. So that's one example of co-designing a public service. A service that was already there is fully digitalized and improved. Another service which you may know which has become very, very popular. It was originally in the UK, Fix My Street. We see this worldwide. We have this in Vienna, we have this in Berlin, we see this in Nigeria, and it has become an incredibly successful way for citizens to collaborate with public administrations, public sector organizations to say, hey, there is this need, and I want the public sector organization, the public administration to react and do something about this problem. And then finally, maybe an example, a very common example of co-assessment, which is where you provide your feedback on a service that has been delivered, and you can say very simply, I liked it, it was okay, it was good. And it's a way of very quickly being able to gauge whether a service that has been delivered was good or wasn't particularly good. So when we put this all together, we see that digital co-creation is very useful, but it's also very complex, which has obviously a major impact on the digital transformation of the public sector and public sector organizations, because even just putting a label like stakeholder next to a phase can be extremely complicated, because who is the stakeholder? Who do we want to reach? Are they the suitable ones we want to reach? How do we avoid inviting the wrong people? So the more you think about the digital co-creation, the more you think about the phases and what it entails and who is involved, the more complicated it gets. So let's briefly go back to definitions and disentangle things again. So co-creation involves professionals from public administrations and citizens, communities, and other stakeholders in order to develop tailored solutions that address the different stakeholders' needs. Digital co-creation is when you use digital tools to support a co-creation process. And then we have the co-creation of digital public services, where you use co-creation as a method to develop digital public services. So let me just remind you again of that issue of being very careful when you read about co-creation or when you're in a discussion about co-creation, digital co-creation, to be very careful about what it is exactly that you're talking about, and what what the person you're talking to is talking about as well. Why has this become so important in the public sector? In the 70s, we had urban governance, which was very much based on centralization with citizens as clients. We then had in the 80s, we had this form of governance, new public manager, where the citizen is seen as a customer. And it is, in fact, this approach which has really led to a failure to deliver public value. So seeing citizens as clients, citizens as customers, has led to being unable to deliver what public administrations and public sector organizations promise. This was highlighted by Ostrom. This idea of co-creation and co-production stems from Ostrom, and in a later publication, she highlights that it is this approach to citizens and other stakeholders as clients, as customers, which makes them very passive, as something that you have to act upon. And instead, we need to rethink that and understand that citizens can play a much more active role, particularly when it's about those services which have an impact on them. So how to address this failure to deliver public value? In the 2000s, we see this change towards trying to develop good governance, which is much more citizen-centric. It's based on principles of cooperation, and that when interacting with public sector organizations, that the services offered are seamless and joined up from the users, from the customers, from the citizens' perspective. And this very much picks up on ideas of the need to consider stakeholders, which is an idea which comes from the business sector, originally by Freeman, and which was picked up by various scholars working in the area of digital government, such as Scholl or Flack and Rose, who described this as a kind of stakeholder governance. So what does this mean? Osborne picked this up in 2006 and suggested this idea of new public governance, which is based on collaboration, emphasizing interaction, emphasizing building relationships across organizational and institutional boundaries. So not just with different stakeholders and with citizens, but also the need for different organizations to communicate and to collaborate together to develop an ecosystem, and also to use the knowledge that different stakeholders can bring to the table, because all services require different stakeholders' knowledge and experiences and a declaration of their needs in order to improve existing public services, and then also to be able to be innovative and develop new innovative public services. This helps to develop better services for future services as well, because sometimes you're engaged in providing your feedback, your experiences, your knowledge, and it might not have an immediate effect on you right now, but it might well have an effect for future users. So future users will also benefit from your current experiences. And what this also does is about opening up public sector organizations, and instead of belly button gazing and just focusing on the internal workings of an organization, on focusing on internal efficiency, it says it's about opening up the organization and making sure that organizations provide better value to the lives of citizens and the service users. At the same time, to these new to this idea of good governance, of collaborative governance, we have some key European documents that are pushing for not just good governance, but more digital good governance. And this started, probably one of the key policies was the e-government benchmark in 2009 that assessed public service maturity on the basis of whether the services were user-centered. This was picked up later on by the Tallinn e-government declaration, which said, okay, and the public services have to be digital, they have to be open, they have to be efficient, they have to be inclusive, they have to be borderless, but especially they have to be user-friendly. So user-friendly from the perspective means from the perspective of the person using the service. A few years later, the Berlin Declaration pushed this idea of user centeredness and user friendliness even more, to describe it as a necessary social participation, and in order to ensure inclusion in the digital world and in order to shape the digital world. We see this now in terms of like AI, for example, in the Digital Europe work programs, where digital tools, but they focus particularly on AI, in order to tailor interaction specifically for citizens and their needs, and in order also in particular to deliver personalized support and make sure that these are accessible across multiple digital domains. So what does this, what are some of the impacts this push for digitalization has? I mean, this it's a slightly older interpretation by Dunleavy, so it's 20 years old, but nonetheless, I think Dunleavy and his colleagues point out some very important aspects, which are that public sector organizations have to integrate the technology into their organization. So it's not something that should be outsourced and left to be done just by the others, but rather it's part of their work. And this has an effect within the organization. And by digitalizing the organization, this has also an impact on civil society, on how the users can access these services. And let's not forget, service users are not just citizens. It can also be business organizations, so organizations from the business sector. And by providing digital services to citizens, to businesses, we can notice a change in the behavior within civil society. At the same time, society, citizens, different stakeholders, businesses also want public administrations and public sector organizations to provide services digitally. So they are informing the public administrations and organizations of their needs and the need to digitalize or to change. So I think this slide shows quite an interesting interaction of, like, it's the push from within the public sector organization, but there's also a push towards the public sector organization to change, and these changes come together and have an impact on policy outcomes, and on the way that then public services are actually delivered. So we do know that COVID has had a major impact on digitalization in the public sector. Previous to COVID, we saw that organizations, public sector organizations, were technology driven. It's nothing new, but however, it was quite slow. It was very evolutionary. It was very careful. It was a very careful way of approaching innovation. The aim was to develop solutions which would lead to predictable responses, which led to a very, very slow organizational change, a very slow digital change. And the Berlin Declaration highlights the need to learn from our experiences from COVID, and to use these experiences in order to boost digital transformation in organizations. One positive impact that we also see is that digitalization has meant that there's a new way of working in the public sector, and that this new way of working requires collaboration. It requires that stakeholders are identified and are involved, and that we need to test new ideas. And in particular, on the basis of this testing, we need to remove what is not working. So we see several positive impacts in the development of new services, which are more user-centered, which means that the services are more likely to be accepted and used, and that we have more transparency. And for public sector organizations, it means that there is organizational development and digital transformation. For the stakeholders, a positive impact is that they have more control over the services that they need, that they're more involved in the design of public services. They are more likely to use the services that they have co-designed. So they're more satisfied with them, and they're also more likely to actually trust them. For society, this means that digitalization has had an impact on the development of the relationships and roles that different stakeholders have to each other, that there is more openness, and that as we move towards a more digital society, we're also able to develop better policies. However, things can go wrong. We have failures, we have co-contamination, we have co-destruction, we have the dark side of digitalization. So what are some of the failures that we need that we have and that we need to address? First of all, engagement does not always lead to better outcomes or to valuable outcomes. We sometimes have different stakeholders who reject the responsibility, who do not want to be held accountable, who face increased costs and so decide that that is not the way they want to do things. And there are often inequalities, and co-creation has very often been seen as a way of kind of like making people who don't have very much, make them do even more work. We also see that digital technologies very often cannot remedy all political problems, but rather they actually strengthen them and create new ones. Transparency can backfire. We can have too much transparency and we get lost in a jungle of information. And cybercrime is and continues to be a real threat for public sector organizations. One of the big problems, one of the big failures is that many public sector organizations still retain an organizational culture, which is a fear of errors. So they're still afraid of making mistakes. They'd rather, before engaging in something that might lead to a mistake or might be difficult, it's better not to do it.
Noella, just looking at the time, just wanted to shortly remind you to come to an end in the next 5 minutes. That would be great, so that we have some time for Q&A and discussion.
Perfect. My last 2 slides. So this is so co-creation is very much and digital co-creation and something that has also been taken on in AI developments now is the need to focus on humans, on individuals, and ethics standards are important in the public sector, but there's a great range of documents and policies, and there has not been a kind of like institutionalization of ethics across all public sector organizations. And there is a real lack of an overall ethical strategy. So what I did with some of my colleagues was we tried to conceptualize an ethics framework for co-creation in the public sector. So we took ethics principles from a guideline that for public participation that is relatively well known. We took research ethics principles that are provided by the European Commission in order to address key co-creation challenges, so the FAT principles of fairness, accountability, and transparency. In the co-creation context, fairness would be ensuring inclusion and stakeholder participation. In terms of accountability, this would mean making sure that there is no biased use of both the user inputs and the responses given. And in terms of transparency, this would be about ensuring that there is trust and building trust in co-creation principles. So this is my last slide, and this is something that I published with my colleagues this year. Is when we put the co-creation challenges and the research ethics principles and the ethical principles of public participation, we came together. We established this as 10 principles, so 10 ethical principles, which is one is it's really important to clearly define the goals of co-creation. What are you trying to do with that? Who is involved, particularly the role of the practitioner? What are the tasks that the practitioner has to do? The practitioner is the one who is responsible for the co-creation and has to make sure that all the contributions are taken into consideration. Trust is important, and trust has to be built, and this means taking into consideration the stakeholders, how are they involved, and how is data managed in the co-creation process. It's also important to very clearly define what are stakeholders expected to do when they're involved in this process. Define what they're doing. Don't expect them to know their role. Define the role. Help them find their role. It's important that the co-creation process is open, that it's transparent, and that all the stakeholders have access to this process. And then there's a need to respect the different communities. The different communities represent different stakeholders, and different stakeholders may have very different backgrounds, very different skills, which can be an advantage, but can also pose great difficulties. And advocacy, it's important that co-creation processes respect the stakeholders without favoring any particular group or particular interest. And of course, commitment is very important. Commitments must be made in good faith, and it's important to support the practice. So whenever it's possible, use co-creation instead of using maybe a different way of approaching a way to solve a problem. So think about how to institutionalize co-creation in an organization.